Many of you may have heard about the recent episode of Joe Rogan's podcast where he interviewed the renowned Jordan Peterson, and at one point in the conversation, the subject turned to the cross of Christ, and Peterson proceeded to explain the cross to Joe Rogan, who's basically an agnostic, in a way that's absolutely breathtaking and that has extraordinary resonances with the ancient Orthodox Christian tradition. And one of the things that Jordan Peterson is doing here is he's helping to usher in what scholars are calling a post-secular age, where the secular barrier between science and religion is breaking down. And with this latest Rogan podcast, I think we could frankly see it imploding. So what I want to play for you today is Peterson's explanation of the cross, and then I'm going to compare it to the ancient Christian tradition of the cross to help us better appreciate this amazing man, as well as the rise of a post-secular, post-globalist age.
Moses leads his people out of the tyranny, right? But weirdly enough, they don't go to the promised land. This is very weird. They go into the desert. Well, why? Well, we're all, say, prisoners of our own tyrannical misconceptions and misperceptions, psychologically and socially. So let's say we free ourselves from those. Well, then we're nowhere. At least we were guided by that. That's why people have nostalgia for tyranny. It's like, at least we had enough to eat then. At least we knew who we were then. It's like out of the tyrant's grasp into the desert. And so you think, why don't people want to challenge their own preconceptions? It's like, yeah, it's out of the tyranny into the desert. And the worse the tyranny, the worse the desert. So if you've been tormenting yourself with tyrannical preconceptions and totalitarian obligations and you decide to drop it, or maybe you're shocked out of that by trauma, you don't go to paradise. You go to the desert. Maybe that's even worse. So no wonder people don't do it. So now the Israelites are out in the desert. You think, why are they there for 40 years? And maybe it's because it takes 3 generations to recover from tyranny. You're in the desert, man. And so the Israelites start worshiping idols. It's ideology. It's the same thing. And that's why, because they don't have anything to orient themselves, because they're not tyrannized anymore, and they get all fractious and they fight with themselves. And Moses has to spend like all day judging their conflicts, because otherwise they're at each other's throats. And anyways, they turn to false idols. And so God isn't very happy about this. And he sends poisonous snakes in there to bite them. So it's like out of the tyranny, into the desert. Now we're fractured by ideologies. Now the poisonous snakes come. And so the poisonous snakes are biting them and biting them and biting them. And they finally break down and go to Moses and say, look, you want to have a chat with God and get him to call off the damn snakes? And Moses says, yeah, okay. And so he goes and talks to God. And God says, this is weird. This is one of those impossibly weird stories. You think this is either insane or it's true, because that's the only options. It's not boring. It's not predictable. It's either insane or it's true. Okay. And maybe we could start by thinking it's insane, but whatever. Moses talks to God, and God could just call off the snakes, right? That's what you'd expect him to do, but that isn't what happens. He says, go make an image of a snake in bronze and make an image of a stick, like a staff, and put the snake on the staff and then stick it in the ground. And then have the Israelites go and look at the snake. And then the snakes won't bite them anymore. So
the snake,
you have to go look on the snake.
Yes.
Okay. Here's a doctrine from all fields of psychotherapy.
Okay.
Look at what you're terrified of, and you will get braver. So the classic therapeutic treatment for terror and the poisoning that terror induces is exposure, voluntary exposure. Yeah. Okay, so the pattern there is face what you're most afraid of, and right. You will be free. Okay.
That makes sense.
Voluntarily.
Yeah.
Now that's a doctrine of psychotherapy now.
Right.
Okay. So now that's weird. That's weird. So God doesn't chase away the snakes. He makes everyone braver. Okay, because that's better than being safe. Bravery is better than safety. It's a more reliable cure for terror. Okay, now, that's cool. But this is even more cool. In the Gospels, Christ says that he has to be lifted up like the serpent in the desert. You think, what the hell does that possibly mean? Because, well, that's a snake first on a stick. And Christ is comparing himself to a snake on a stick? Okay, so what is this? What can this possibly mean? Well, I was thinking about that in relationship to imagery of the crucifix and the story that surrounds it. So Jung thought that the Passion story was archetypal because it's a limit story, like this, this debate at Oxford. You cannot write a more tragic story. It's impossible, technically. Why? Well, because it's a story of the aggregation of everything that people are afraid of. So there was no death more painful than crucifixion. That's why the Romans invented it. It was to punish political miscreants. It was the slow, agonizing death by suffocation, essentially, and dehydration and exposure. It's extraordinarily painful. Okay, so that sucks. That's pain, man. Plus, you know it's coming. That's part of the story. Plus, your best friend betrayed you into it. Plus, your people turned against you. Plus, they're led by a tyrant who doubts truth. Plus, you're a victim of the Roman Empire. Plus, you're completely innocent. Plus, everybody knows it. Plus, they choose a criminal to be released from this experience instead of you, even though they know he's a criminal and they know you're innocent. So, and you're young, and you've done no wrong, and all you've done is help people. So it's a limit story. Okay, so then you think, we've been looking at that limit story for 2,000 years in the image and in the story. What are we doing? Well, you're supposed to visit the stations of the cross, let's say. Okay, here's the idea. You hear the crucifixion story, and you play with it. Who are you? Maybe if you're female, you're Mary, and why is that? It's the Pieta, because you have to offer your children to the destruction of the world. That's female courage. That's the mother that doesn't hold her child back. It's like, go out. To what? Eventually your death and destruction. Go out. Leave me. Be in the world. That's feminine courage, man, to let her baby go. You're Pilate. You doubt truth, but you'll go along with the crowd. You're Judas because you betray your best friend. You're the mob. You're the criminal. All of that, that's you. You look on all those things that you hate and are terrified by. That's not a snake. It's like the worst of all possible snakes everywhere. That's what you're looking at. What do you see? You see death, you see destruction, pain, terror, tyranny, frailty, betrayal. Look harder. Look harder. Look harder. What do you see? The death and resurrection. You look far enough into the abyss, you see the light.
Now, I think what Jordan Peterson is saying here about the bronze serpent, which is later identified in Scripture with the cross of Christ, it's so fascinating and has very deep resonance within the Christian tradition. This notion that we conquer our fears by facing them, or in Peterson's words, face what you're most afraid of and you'll be free. The best cure for terror is to stare into the face of what's most terrifying. Or in the case of the cross, we overcome the tragedies of our own lives by staring into the abyss of the ultimate tragedy through which we see light, which is the light of the resurrection. Now, this psychoanalytic assessment of Peterson's actually has deep Christian resonances because, as Orthodox theologians have written extensively about, the cross is where God and humanity confront each other in the deepest and starkest of terms. What we have to understand is that the cross, in the Christian tradition, the cross is the ultimate expression of reality. And that's because it's through the cross that humanity is revealed not for who we really are, but what we've really become in the fall, induced by the serpent. When Christ, who is absolute truth, comes into a world conquered and comprised of lies and power and manipulation and sin, in such a world, truth can only appear as crucified, by definition. When we stare at the cross, we're looking into a mirror, as Peterson points out. We're looking into a mirror that reveals what we've become in our sin and in our collective madness. We may think we're cool, we may think we're hip, we may think we got it all together, but the cross reveals to us that when truth, absolute truth, comes in our midst, we crucify it. We destroy it. That's what we become, no matter how cool we may think we are. And there's the serpent. The serpent is us, as it were. We become the serpent who first appeared at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, with that tree now being revealed through the wood of the cross. But then Peterson noted that there's light piercing through this darkness. You see, in that cruciform display of our madness and our violence, we suddenly realize that we're gazing into the face of a divine love that knows absolutely no bounds, no depths too low. We see the God of all creation willingly and passively submitting himself to our murder and our madness, so as to shine forth the limitless radiance of his divine self-giving, self-emptying love. And the more we mock him, the more we scourge him, the more we spit on him, torture him, crush him, the more we demonstrate the infinite, unfathomable depths of his love. And so this is why there's the resurrection. The resurrection is the glorious revelation that this love, that has by all appearances been conquered and extinguished by our sin on the cross, this love is in fact unconquerable and inextinguishable. The resurrection reveals for all to see that this love is ultimately unconquerable and inextinguishable. Infinite in its abundance, eternal in its life, which in turn awakens a comparable love within us and thus restores us back to paradise, back to where we were always meant to be. And so the Orthodox Christian tradition brings all of this together. Jonathan Peugeot does a great job with this. He notes that the serpent, it's first associated with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, can be developed as both good and evil, like the knowledge of the tree itself. The serpent can most certainly be a symbol of evil, but it can also be seen as a manifestation of the good, as we see, for example, with the healing power, the bronze serpent with Moses in the wilderness, which is a healing power that resonates in the Greek medicinal tradition of the snake wrapped around the rod of Asclepius, right, which we use today as the symbol of our modern medicine. In fact, when Moses was first called by God, God turned his rod, his staff, into a snake that would later eat the evil snakes of Pharaoh's magicians. And interestingly, in the ancient Eastern Orthodox tradition, these events are all tied together with the vision that Moses' staff was actually made from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then later, the cross of Christ, particularly the horizontal bar, where his hands are nailed and outstretched, that part of the cross was made from the wood of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, while the vertical bar, as it were, that connects heaven and earth, that was made from the wood of the tree of life. And interestingly, in the crucifixion account, Jesus is surrounded by two thieves, just as the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was surrounded by the two thieves, Adam and Eve, who stole the fruit from the tree. So this is why the 2nd century theologian Irenaeus sees Mary as the new Eve, who gives up the fruit of her womb and places the fruit back onto the tree to restore the world to its original Edenic harmony. And so here in the midst of all of the sin, death, and curse, the cross blossoms forth into a tree of life for the renewal of the entire cosmos, and thus restores us back to paradise. So bravo to Jordan Peterson. He's knocking down the ridiculous secular wall between science and religion, and he's helping pave the way to the rise of a new and indeed redemptive post-secular age. God bless.